Okay. Not only did I lay down my Bible, I forgot to put on my microphone. I'm just got too many. No. Of course, when you're in a hurry, there we go. I just clip it to my collar. So it doesn't. All right. Well, when you're in a hurry, you lay things down, and then you don't know where you put them. So I was like, I set my Bible down, and where did I set it down? It was always in the last place you look, isn't it? So anyway, all right. Well, good evening. It is not quite as cold as it was yesterday, I guess, is it? It's getting a little less frozen than it was, but I'm glad to come together. And Gina, I'm gonna invite you one more time to be our. Would you hand these out? And these two look alike, but they're not the same thing. They're both maps, but one of them, they can tell from the words on the side. One of them says the battle at Michmash, and the other one says Philistines advance into the hill country. So, but they look pretty similar, and just because sometimes when you're all these weird names and battles and people moving from place to place, it just helps to have some sense of what are we talking about. And even this may not give you a great sense of where we're talking about, but at least we're talking about real places and with real names and real movements. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but some folks really like to say, okay, they moved from here to here and that kind of thing. So just to recap where we've been, it's called the books of Samuel. Samuel definitely is the dominant figure in the first maybe 10, 11 chapters of the book of 1 Samuel. By the time we get to 2 Samuel, he's not really a character hardly at all. But we have Samuel, who's born of a woman, Hannah, who thought she was not able to have a child. She gives him to the Lord, which means he is raised mainly by the priest Eli. Eli's sons, who were sort of meant to succeed him as priest and leader, are corrupt. Their corruption leads to their death. Samuel grows up and becomes a priest, a judge, and the leader of the people. A priest, prophet, judge, all rolled into one. And we see him and we see how he rises in God's favor. We also see how the people, as the Philistines particularly, become a threat. This coastal people who are more powerful in terms of weaponry and organization than the 12 tribes. How the people start to say, we need a king. And so we read last week how Samuel is directed, since he tells the people in calling for a king, you're really rejecting God, especially the way they phrased it. We want to be like the other nations and have a king, because Israel, of course, was not supposed to be like the other nations. That was part of the whole chosen people thing. They were not supposed to be like other nations. But they said, we want a king like everybody else. And so even though Samuel warns them that will cause a king will draft their sons and take their daughters and tax them and on and on and on, God says, you've made your choice. And this man, Saul, we talked last week about how there's sort of a three-part coronation. The first is in secret. Really only Samuel and Saul know that God has anointed him and chosen him. Then there is a sort of a lottery that is guided by God, where they narrow it down by tribe or by tribe and clan and family until the lot falls to Saul, son of Kish, a Benjamite. But then Saul musters the people to rescue people who are about to be not only subjugated, but have their eyes removed, one of their eyes removed. And when Saul is able to rescue the citizens of that city of Jabesh, it is then truly that he becomes king, not just by the fact that Samuel picked him out or that a lottery fell to him, but by his leadership, by his victory over the enemy, by his rescuing of the city. He is now recognized as the true king, the one the people want. And the scoffers who, at the time of the lottery, said, well, who's this guy? We don't think this, who said he could lead us? After the great victory, they say, let's bring those guys in, those scoffers, and let's kill them. And Saul is like, no, this is not a day for any of us to die. He's magnanimous. He doesn't take revenge against the ones who questioned his leadership, and that just elevates him all the more. And as I said at the end of last time, this is the high point for Saul. This is as high as he goes in terms of doing the right thing, military victory, the acclaim of the people. I mean, this is about as high as it gets. So he is now established as king. And so we turn to 1 Samuel 12. 1 Samuel 12, which, as you see, at least in my Bible, the subheading there is Samuel's farewell speech. And this is something that actually we've seen several times in the Bible. Moses makes a farewell speech when they finally come to the edge of the promised land after the 40 years of wandering, and God has told Moses, who of course is quite old by this point, but because of Moses's sort of one time of disobedience to God, God has said, you're not going to get to cross over. And so Moses makes a farewell speech telling the people basically, if you follow the Lord, you'll have prosperity in life. If you don't, it's not going to go well. So we have the farewell speech of Moses. Then, Joshua takes the leadership role. Joshua is really the first judge in many ways. Joshua leads the people to the battles that they used to overtake the Canaanites, starting with Jericho and going on. And then when Joshua gets to be old, he too makes a farewell speech before he dies. And so this idea of a farewell speech is already happened a few times. So here's Samuel's farewell speech in chapter 12. First Samuel said to all Israel, I've listened to everything you said to me, and I've set a king over you. In other words, you wanted a king, you got a king. Now you have a king as your leader. As for me, I am old and gray, and my sons are here with you. But remember, his sons were not king material or judge material. They were also corrupt and not good. I have been your leader from my youth until this day. Yeah, literally, he grew up in the temple or the tabernacle there, and he grew up into the leadership role and has really, from the time of a young man until now, has been the leader of the people. This loose confederation of tribes. Here I stand. Testify against me in the presence of the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? From whose hand have I accepted a bribe to make me shut my eyes? If I've done any of these, I will make it right. In other words, basically he's saying, have I ever done anything unjust? Have I ever accepted a bribe? Have I ever taken something I shouldn't have taken? Have I ever done anything that would cause you to question my integrity or that I was following the Lord? Basically saying, if you feel I've cheated you, if I feel I've done anything that I shouldn't have done, speak up and I'll make it right. And it says, the people, you have not cheated or oppressed us, they replied. You have not taken anything from anyone's hand. So he has led a scandal-free leadership. Samuel said to them, the Lord, Yahweh, is witness against you, and also his anointed is witness this day that you have not found anything in my hand. In other words, any bribe, anything slipped under the table. I have not taken anything from you. He is witness, they said. Then Samuel said to the people, he's going to give them a little history lesson, which is also part of often these farewell speeches. It's the Lord who appointed Moses and Aaron and brought your forefathers up out of Egypt. Now then, stand here, because I'm going to confront you with evidence before the Lord as to all the righteous act performed by the Lord for you and your fathers. Luckily, this isn't quite as lengthy a history lesson as some of the other speeches, but it still goes on for a bit. After Jacob entered Egypt, back to Genesis now, Jacob, they cried out to the Lord for help, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your forefathers out of Egypt and settled them in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God. He sold them into the hand of Sisera, the commander of the armor of Hazor, into the hands of the Philistines and the king of Moab, who fought against them. These are things that happen in the book of Judges. And these are episodes that happen in the book of Judges. They cried out to the Lord and said, we have sinned, we have forsaken the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroths. Deliver us from the hands of our enemies, and we'll serve you. And the Lord sent Jerubbaal, at least what's his other name? You remember? Jerubbaal's other name is Gideon. Gideon is who that's a reference to. If you remember when he spoke out against Baal, they gave him this nickname of Jerubbaal, one who opposed Baal. So that's Gideon. He rose up, Jerubbaal, a.k.a. Gideon, Barak, which is also, some say Balaam, Japheth, and now my Bible has Samuel, but also has a clue or a little note that he's not referring to himself there, that probably actually in many manuscripts, instead of saying Samuel, it says Samson. The two words are so when we talk about ancient manuscripts, that particular sentence, some have the name Samuel there, and some have the name Samson there. My Bible has Samuel, but it also has a note that says a lot of other manuscripts say Samson. And if he's recounting the history, it's probably more likely that he references Samson than himself. But it's possible he referenced himself. But either way, it doesn't matter. He's referencing the judges who answered the call. He delivered you from the hands of your enemies on every side so that you lived securely. So this is a recap of the history of the judges. But when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, was moving against you, you said to me, no, we want a king to rule over us, even though Yahweh your God was your king. Now, here's the king you've chosen. Here he is. Here's Saul. The one you asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him and don't rebel against his commands, if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. Okay, you'll be okay. But if you don't obey the Lord, if you do rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you as it was against your fathers. So this is a common theme that was both Moses did the same thing, Joshua did the same thing. You have a choice. Follow the Lord and you'll prosper and things will go well. Don't follow him, things will not go well. You've got this either or choice. Now then, stand still and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest now? I'll call upon the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. In other words, I'm going to show you that, I really am God's prophet. I'm going to show you one more time that God does speak to me, that I can call upon God and he will send rain. And by the way, the time of the harvest, the wheat harvest, was not a time of a lot of rain. Rain was not common during that season. So for rain to come, especially when he says, it's going to rain here in a minute, for rain to come sort of at his word in that season of the year was unusual. So sure enough, Samuel called on the Lord. That same day the Lord sent thunder and rain. So all the people stood in awe of the Lord and of Samuel. Like, wow, he really is close to God. The people all said to Samuel, pray to the Lord. This is the people's response. Pray to the Lord your God for your servants so that we will not die. For we've added to all of our other sins of evil in asking for a king. Like, yeah, okay, we know we shouldn't have done it, but we did it, and he's got a king now, and pray that we don't pay the price. God's not still mad at us. Don't be afraid, Samuel replied. You have done all this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Don't turn away to useless idols. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you, because they're useless. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you. I think that's a really interesting sentence, that far be it from me to not pray for you. Of course I'll pray for you. I'll teach you the way that is good and right. But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he's done for you. Yet if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will be swept away. So it's pretty clear. He's just saying, which of these two ways are you going to go? And sort of the king and the people are all sort of, the king and the people can go one way, or the king and the people can go another way. One of the things about really the entire Bible, especially the Old Testament, our modern Western sense of individualism is not really there in the Bible. In other words, God punishes the people, not the individual. I mean, God's blessings are upon the people, or God's punishments are upon the people. And we tend to think, we're much more individualistic in the way we think about these things. As individuals, they're much more tribal about how they think about things. God blesses the nation or he curses the nation. God, it's not so much the individuals as it is the whole. And it's just, you see this, it's hard for us to wrap our heads, at least I think it is for me, to escape the way we were all raised, which is much more individualistic than sense of being a part of a larger unit that receives blessing or curses, that's rewarded or punished. But that's really the way the Old Testament is often set up. The people are rewarded or the people are punished, not so much the individual sometimes. So now here we go, Saul, chapter 13. Mine again has, Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel for 2 years. Both of those numbers appear in some manuscripts, but not in others. Most of the oldest manuscripts don't have any number there. It just says Saul reigned over Israel. It doesn't have a number. The later manuscripts put that number in there. But, and this just a side, not to spend too much on a side trail or a rabbit trail here. Our Bible is based on the best ancient copies of the scriptures that we have. But none of what we have are the originals. The oldest copies of the Old Testament that we have are hundreds of years after the fact. Hundreds of years after the fact. We don't have manuscripts that are the originals. We have copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. And there's a whole subset of biblical scholarship which is looking at all the various manuscripts that we have of the Old Testament and the New Testament for that matter, and trying to make sure we have the most accurate and oldest copy that we have to use to copy and translate it into English for us. One of the great discoveries of the 20th century was the Dead Sea Scrolls. And again, without going too far down that trail, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1947 in caves in Qumran. Qumran was where there was a monastic sect in the desert that practiced a lot of almost like a monastery in the desert, a Jewish monastery, for lack of a better analogy. And they had copies of the Old Testament, which of course they would just call the Scriptures or Torah. And they kept those in jars. Those scrolls were in jars in caves. And because of where they were kept in those caves in the desert of Qumran, they were preserved. Now that community of Qumran was about around the same time of Jesus, so around 2,000 years ago. They were discovered in 1947 in those caves. They became the most ancient versions of the Old Testament ever discovered. And they compared them to the other later versions of the Old Testament that the scholars had been using that were several hundred years more recent than those scrolls. And the good news is the differences between those Dead Sea Scrolls and the more recent copies was insignificant. I mean, they were almost word for word the same. There was maybe a jot and a tittle, as they would say, a word here or there, a thee or an a or an an. But in large part, they showed no variation. It showed the care of those who would copy and copy and copy. The same goes for the New Testament, which was more recent, of course. But we don't have Paul's original letters. We have copies of copies of copies. And so there's a whole field of study that is dedicated to studying all these various manuscripts that we have in Greek and in Hebrew, and making sure we have the most ancient ones, the most accurate ones, and do they agree with each other? So, and that's a whole field of biblical scholarship. And that's why sometimes you will find a note in a Bible that say, some versions say this, and it'll be a very minor point. Like, it won't be anything that changes the point, that changes the thrust of the Scripture. It won't change the theology. It won't change the commandment. It won't change the law. It might be a different spelling of a word. It might be a different number of how many troops there were, how many thousands of troops there were, or something like that. It'll be something relatively insignificant. But there are sometimes, like in this case, the most ancient manuscripts of 1 Samuel do not have the age or how old Saul was when he became king. That number comes from what's called the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. The Septuagint is the Greek Old Testament, because one of the earliest translations of the Old Testament was from Hebrew to Greek. And that Greek Old Testament is called the Septuagint. It's called the Septuagint because the story, which may or may not be true, was that they decided to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek. And they got 70 scholars who spoke both languages, who went into 70 different rooms and did the translation. And the story is they were all identical. They all translated it the identical way. Now that's a legend, which, we're not sure about the truth of that. That's why it's called the Septuagint, because it means 70. There were 70 scholars who did the translation from Hebrew to Greek of the Old Testament. And for a long time, the Hebrew is a difficult language, believe me, because I had to study it. In some cases, like the Latin Bible, which is called the Vulgate, the Latin Bible was translated from the Greek Bible, from the Hebrew Bible. You want to know why it was called the Vulgate? Because it was translated from the beautiful language of Greek to the vulgar language of Latin. So it's called the Vulgate. Anyway, all that to say, sometimes when you have a note in your Bible, some manuscripts say this. That's what that's all about. So that's probably more than you wanted to know. But so Saul was 30 years old, maybe, and he reigned over Israel for 2 years, which probably actually a little longer than that if you read the whole story. Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. The rest of the men he sent back to their homes. Jonathan, remember Jonathan is Saul's son, who's going to play a large role in the rest of the story. Jonathan is Saul's son who becomes David's best friend. Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." So all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel has become a stench to the Philistines, and the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. So Saul is, we're going to see from some of this that the Philistines were really dominant over the Israelites in many ways, almost an occupying force. Even though there were fewer Philistines than there were Jews or Hebrews, Israelites, but the Philistines had so much more advanced weaponry and had chariots and swords and all kinds. They were much more advanced in weaponry. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. That may be something of an exaggeration. They went. It's kind of like, when you say exaggeration, when the spies going back to when they're getting ready to cross the Jordan and go into the promised land and say, "Can we take it from the Canaanites?" And they send the 12 spies over, and they say, "Yeah, it's a land of milk and honey. It's great, but the people who live there are giants, and we're like grasshoppers next to them." That would probably be an exaggeration. But it's, "Oh, those people, they're huge. We're just like babies next to them." A little bit of exaggeration. So the Philistines got chariots and so many men and soldiers. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Bethaven. When the men of Israel saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard pressed, they hid in caves and thickets among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. You don't want to hide in a cistern. You know what that is? That's the sewer. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. In other words, on the east side of the Jordan River. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops were with him, quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. Now, okay, there's a little piece of information here that we're supposed to assume that you may not be obvious. They're getting ready to go fight the Philistines. But before they're going to go into battle, they need Samuel. Why? They're going to have a religious service before the battle. They're going to make a sacrifice to the Lord. In other words, before they go into battle, they're like, before we can go into battle, we need to go out there and, we need to have Samuel come, and we're all going to have a worship service, and he's going to make a sacrifice to the Lord, and then that will enable us to then be ready to go fight those Philistines. And so Samuel said, "I'll be there in 7 days, and I'll offer the sacrifice, and then go get those Philistines." Okay? It says, so Saul, back at verse 8, 13:8, he being Saul, waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel didn't come to Gilgal. And Saul's men began to scatter. Like, oh, I guess we're not going to go fight. So he said, bring me the burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered the burnt offering. Is Saul a priest? No. Saul is not a priest. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. What have you done? Said Samuel. Saul replied, well, when I saw that the men were scattering, and you didn't come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I haven't sought the Lord's favor, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. A very logical response, right? Like, you weren't here. The men were starting to leave. I knew we had to have an offering to the Lord before we could go into battle, but you weren't here, so I did it myself. You say, well, that kind of makes sense. You acted foolishly, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. Like, you knew you were not supposed to make the offering. You're not a priest. And you must think, well, but he had no. He was not supposed to do it. And of course, as soon as he did it, Samuel walks up to him. Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah and Benjamin, and Saul counted the men who were with him, and they numbered about 600. So this is the first sign, really, that Saul's hold on leadership is going to slip away. Matter of fact, it's pretty much foreshadowing God's going to choose someone else, a man after his own heart, which is going to be a description of somebody that we're going to meet shortly, a man after God's own heart. But it doesn't necessarily doom the battle, but it causes, we've got problems. We've got a crack here. Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying at Gibeah in Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. So this is where it says the Philistines advance into the central hill country. You see the 3 little arrows. This is the Philistines sending out raiding parties, those 3 red arrows. And you see how it says the Philistines were assembling their forces at Michmash. Number 2, Philistines were assembling the massive force at Michmash, leading Saul to retreat to Gilgal to muster more of Israel's forces. Okay, and look at number 3. It says, many Israelites hide in fear from the Philistines. Some flee across the Jordan to Gad and Gilead. Saul grows desperate, waiting for the Samuel to arrive to offer the sacrifice. He offers the sacrifice himself. Then he and his forces rejoin Jonathan's forces at Geba. So this is just a map basically showing all the stuff we just read. Okay. So, verse 13, 16. Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying at Gibeah in Benjamin, the tribe in the territory of Benjamin, which is this tribe of Saul, the smallest of the tribes, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties, this is what that map is showing, went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned toward Ophrah in the vicinity of Shaul, another towards Beth Horon, the third towards the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboim, facing the desert. That's all on your map. Now here's something that's really distressing for the Jewish people, for the Israelites. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. there were no blacksmiths in Israel. If they wanted anything sharpened, they had to go to the Philistines. Their plow. And it even tells us how much it cost to get something sharpened. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plowshares and mattocks, 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes, and repointing goads. So, I mean, that gets us pretty specific about the cost of sharpening things. So, that puts them at a distinct disadvantage in terms of weaponry. So, on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or a spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. That's not good if you're going to fight a battle without any swords or spears. Now, okay, so you have to resort to more clever ways of fighting. Now, a detachment of Philistines, chapter 14, had gone out on the pass at Michmash. One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to the young man bearing his armor, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he didn't tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree. Pomegranate is very popular in Israel. One of the things when we went to Israel both times, and there would be street vendors, and it wasn't a lemonade stand or a coffee, it was pomegranate juice. Pomegranate juice is still popular in Israel today. Where was I? Okay. In pomegranate tree. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was the son of Ichabod's brother, Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest at Shiloh. That's a reference way back to those rotten boys that were Eli's sons, if you remember them. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost, there was a cliff. One was called Bozez, the other was called Seneh. One cliff stood to the north towards Michmash, and the other to the south towards Geba. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised fellows." This is a way of referring to a foreigner. Remember, the Jews, all Jewish men were circumcised, but that was not common among other tribes and peoples. Circumcision was not a common ritual so the Jews often, or the Israelites, would sometimes refer to foreigners or those uncircumcised fellows, just to differentiate them from the Israelites. Okay. Let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised fellows. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from serving, whether by many or by few. So Jonathan has a lot of trust and faith in the Lord that just a few of them can take on a much larger group of Philistines. "Do all that you have in mind," his armor-bearer said. "Go ahead, I'm with you heart and soul." Jonathan said, "Come, we'll cross over towards the men and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait here until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. If they say, 'Come up to us,' we'll climb up, because that'll be the sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they're hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor, "Come up here and we'll teach you a lesson." As in, we're going to kill you. So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me, and the Lord has given them into our hands." Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, with his armor-bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. In the first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed about 20 men in the area in about half an acre. So this, I'm trying to picture this sort of a pass between, it was like squeezing where, it allowed them probably, I'm assuming, to not have to take on all these guys at the same time, because it was a narrow pass. So Jonathan and his armor bearer are able to kill about 20 Philistines. Then panic struck the whole army, the Philistine army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. There's an earthquake at the same time. It was a panic sent by God. So in the middle of this, at the Philistine camp, not only do they hear, oh, they're coming out of the rocks, they're coming out of the caves, they're coming to get us, and now there's an earthquake. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah in Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Saul said to his men who were with him, muster the forces and see who has left us. When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor bearer who were not there. Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God. So they've got the upper hand now because of this. The Philistines are panicking because of this earthquake. He says, bring the ark of God, which, we've had that come up before. At that time, it was with the Israelites. While Saul was talking to a priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. Saul and all his men assembled and went into the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So the Lord rescued Israel that day, and the battle moved on beyond Beth-aven. So here's this other map about this battle. So this is notice at the bottom it says the battle at Michmash. During the reign of Saul, a detachment of Philistines pushed far into the interior of Israel and occupied the strategic pass at Michmash. After a while, Jonathan led his armor bearer in an attack on the Philistine outpost near Michmash by scaling, and it goes on and got cut off. But anyway, you see the map of where all this occurred that we are reading about here. And again, you don't have to know all the geography, but it just makes it a little more easy to visualize. So, Jonathan trusted God, and God delivered on this earthquake, and it was a victory for the Israelites. But there's still going to be, Saul is going to show, his leadership is not as good as it should have been. Verse 24. Now the men in Israel were in distress. Well, they're in distress. Why are they in distress? They just won. Because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, cursed be any man who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies. So none of the troops tasted food. Now this is one of those, tough guy things that really doesn't work. Like, until we achieve our objective, we're not even going to eat until we do this. None of us are going to eat until we've polished them off and we've gotten vengeance on our enemies. Nobody eat, which is a stupid thing, frankly, because how does an army travel? On its stomach, right? As they say, an army travels on its stomach. So he's basically told, nobody eat. So that's why they are in distress. It says, the entire army entered the woods. There was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth. They feared the oath. But Jonathan hadn't heard that his father had bound the people with an oath. So he reached out at the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth and his eyes brightened. Like just a little taste of something. Then one of the soldiers told him, your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, cursed be any man who eats food today. That's why the men are faint. That's why everybody's like, Jonathan said, my father's made trouble for the country. see how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of the honey? How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? Couldn't we have chased them down and polished them off even better? If we weren't weak from hunger, if we were operating on a full stomach, that basically saying, my dad, that was not a good thing my dad did. That day, the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Ajalon. They were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. They are famished. Now, that sentence is not just yucky and gross. What's wrong with that? Huh? Right. They are not supposed to have any blood. The kosher laws, the kosher food laws, we know some of those food laws. Like, for example, we know us Gentiles, we are the goyim. Goyim is Hebrew for Gentile. One is a goy, a whole bunch is a goyim. Us goyim, us Gentiles, we know a little bit about kosher laws. Like, we know, okay, no pork, right? We know that part. No pork chops, no bacon, no ham, no, etc. We know that. We might, if we know a little bit more about the kosher laws, we know, okay, no shellfish. Shellfish aren't kosher. We know you cannot have meat and dairy on the same plate. If you know anything about the kosher laws, you cannot mix dairy and meat. The hotel we stayed at in Israel both times, breakfast, there was dairy but no meat. Dinner, there was meat but no dairy. You had to keep those two things separate. When I was at OU taking classes with the rabbi at the Hillel Foundation, he said to us, don't bring your cheeseburgers in here, because a cheeseburger is mixing meat and dairy. So that's a kosher law, but most of us may not realize that the kosher law says no blood. You cannot eat blood, drink blood, and for something to be, for food to be kosher, you have to drain all the blood out of it. Kosher meat is frankly dry because you drain all the blood out of it. When some of us went to England, I know they have this horrible thing in England called blood pudding. Anyway, but British food is terrible all around. But you have to drain all the blood out of everything. And again, trivia, side note, do you know why Jehovah's Witnesses cannot have a blood transfusion? Because they interpret a blood transfusion as the same thing as eating or drinking blood, which they see as a commandment of God that impacts them, not just the Jews, but them too. Anyway, so the men are so famished, they're eating the meat with the blood, which is not kosher. Verse 33, someone said to Saul, look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it. You've broken faith, he said. Roll a large stone over here at once. Then he said, go out among the men and tell them, each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Don't sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it. In other words, I think we're to assume they're going to drain the blood or hopefully cook it. My goodness. But so everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this. Saul said, let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive. Do whatever seems best to you, they replied. But the priest said, let us inquire of God here. Saul asked God, "Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand?" But God didn't answer him that day. He gets no response from God. Saul therefore said, "Come here, all of you who are leaders of the army, let us find out what sin has been committed today." In other words, somebody has messed up, and that's why God won't answer me. Somebody has done something to displease God, and that's why God won't give me an answer here. "As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if it lies with my son Jonathan, he must die." But not one of the men said a word. Whoever is messed up is going to have to die. Saul said to the Israelites, "You stand over there, and I and Jonathan, my son, will stand over here." "Do what seems best to you," the men replied. Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, "Give me the right answer." And Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. In other words, who sinned? Was it these men, or was it me and my son? Oh, it was me and my son. And then Saul said, "Cast the lot between us." And it was Jonathan. Jonathan's the one who sinned. Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you did. What have you done? What have you done to displease the Lord?" And Jonathan told him, "I merely tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die? Like, are you kidding me?" Saul said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you don't die, Jonathan. It's your fault. I made a vow before the Lord. Anybody who ate had to die." But the men said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never! As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair on his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help." So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Well, because that was a stupid thing that Saul did. But not only was it a stupid thing, making this ridiculous, we're not going to eat until we polish them off. Now, what's the problem with Saul's leadership now? The men, his men, he's the general, right? And he has made a decision. Jonathan must die. And his men have said, no, that's not going to happen. The men are right, but if you're the leader, if you're a commander of a fighting force, and your men say, "We're not going to follow you or obey you," that's a problem. It's a problem. Even though it was a stupid order, the fact that they didn't follow the order now creates a dynamic between Saul and the men, like, well, he gives stupid orders and we're not going to follow him. And that's not good for a leader. So Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines, and they withdrew to their own land. After Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side: Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. In other words, he's surrounded by enemies. Israel, which is kind of common for Israel, Israel is always surrounded by enemies on every side. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who'd plundered them. So, here's what someone said in a commentary. Saul is a great soldier and a lousy king. He's a really good soldier. He's a really good warrior. But he's not, remember, he's the tallest man in Israel. He's obviously a big, strong man. He's a great soldier, but he's not a great king. So now a little side to tell us about his family. Saul's sons were Jonathan. Okay, we know about him. He's going to become a major player in this book. Saul's sons were Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchishua. The name of his older daughter was Merab. Now the younger one was Michal. She's going to play a role in this as well. Spoiler alert, she's going to marry David. His wife's name was Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz. The name of the commander of Saul's army was Abner, son of Ner, and Ner was Saul's uncle. So the commander of his army was his first cousin. Saul's father Kish and Abner's father Ner were sons of Abiel. Okay, so this is all in the family. All the days of Saul, there was bitter war with the Philistines. And whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service. So in other words, just like Samuel said, he's going to conscript your man into the army. But so Saul is surrounded by enemies, fighting battles on every front. And now we're going to see, sadly, what happens next with Saul. Samuel said to Saul, chapter 15, I'm the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Okay, way back in the book of Exodus, when Israel comes out of Egypt, one of the first problems they have after they finally get away from Egypt and cross the Red Sea and all that, the Amalekites attack them. The Amalekites were desert nomadic raiders. Instead of having necessarily territory, the Amalekites would just attack a village and plunder it. Kill the men, steal the women, take all the stuff. They were a roving band of bandits and raiders, okay, and they raided the Israelites as they were coming out of Egypt, and that, of course, by the time of this story, that's a couple of 100 years in the past. But he says the Amalekites have been a thorn and a problem and an enemy ever since that. Now, this is Samuel talking to Saul. Go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men, women, children, infants, cattle, sheep, camels, and donkeys. Now, right there, that hits us kind of hard. Because we're like, well, killing the soldiers and the men is one thing, but killing everybody, women, children, animals, all that, this is pretty hard for us to swallow, frankly. And I think without going too far into a side road, it shows us that, at least the way I believe, the way I think, that what we see in the Bible is a gradual progression of how God's people really understood God. And I think we see in this, this idea of total annihilation, I'm not sure that reflects the heart of God. I'm not sure that is, an adequate reflection of what God really wanted them to do. Now, the Amalekites probably did not have many women and children. They were mainly a band of marauders. But anyway, for us to hear, wipe them out, is hard for us to hear. I mean, it wouldn't be hard for us to hear a couple 100 years ago. That was the way warfare was. You wiped out everybody. But I think in our modern sense, we have a hard time hearing that. But that's what Samuel says to Saul, go wipe them out. Everybody. So Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men from Judah. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine, and he said to the Kenites, go away, leave the Amalekites, so I don't destroy you along with them. You showed kindness to the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites are close to the Amalekites. He says, you need to get out of here because you don't want to get caught up in this. So they leave. And verse 7, Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur to the east of Egypt. He took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the cattle and the fat calves and the lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely. Everything that was despised and weak they destroyed. So they're like, these are perfectly good animals. And we can add, these are worth something. I mean, this is plunder. This is the sheep and the cattle. And I mean, why would we kill them? We need to just capture those and take it as plunder. So they don't do that. They take the healthy, good animals. They kill all the people, but they take the animals. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I'm grieved that I made Saul king. He's turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was troubled. He cried out to the Lord all that night. God said, destroy everything, and they didn't do it. Again, we kind of go, well, why would they want to just totally destroy everything? Well, in some ways, I say in our modern way of thinking about it, that's a question about how did they really hear this from God? Was this really what God wanted? You have to put that question aside. But the understanding from Samuel was that was what God wanted, and Saul didn't do it. So, early in the morning, verse 12, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, Saul has gone to Carmel. There he set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal. Samuel reached him, and Saul said, the Lord bless you. I've carried out the Lord's instructions. But Samuel said, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? In other words, the instruction were to get rid of everything. Man, woman, child, animal, everything. Why do I hear sheep and cattle? Saul answered, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites, and they spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord. But we totally destroyed the rest. Were they really going to give all this to the Lord? Yeah, probably not. Stop, Samuel said to Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord told me last night. Tell me, Saul replied. Samuel said, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission saying, go and completely destroy those wicked people, those Amalekites, make war on them until you've wiped them out. Why didn't you obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I destroyed the Amalekites, and I brought back Agag, their king, and the soldiers took the sheep and the cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. I did do what you said, kind of, sort of. We wiped out the people, and the men wanted the plunder, and we're going to give the best of the plunder back to God. So it's all good. And we're going to sacrifice. Notice he says, to your God. He doesn't say to our God. He says, to your God. But Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice. To heed is better than the fat of rams. Rebellion is like the sin of divination. Arrogance is like the evil of idolatry. Because you've rejected the word of the Lord, he's rejected you as king. Now the deeper, at least for me, I think the deeper point of this story, you can say, well, did it really make sense to kill the animals? What did the animals do? That's really not the point of the story. The point of the story is he had direction. Samuel told him what to do, and he said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'll do something close to that, kind of like that, but I'm going to modify it and do something that I think's better. And that was his downfall. He didn't listen and obey. And then he says, but I'm going to give the best of the plunder to the Lord. That'll make it all good. If I give the best of the plunder to the Lord, won't that make up for me not following orders? And Samuel's response here is one that is not just about this episode, but I think is an ongoing. God would rather have obedience than sacrifice. In other words, God would rather have obedience than religious ritual. He's like, well, we were going to burn the sacrifices on the altar to the God. And Samuel says, obeying would have been better than offering the animal on the altar. God would rather have the obedience of your heart than a religious ritual. And we're going to see that all through the prophets in the Old Testament, or you will see that all through the prophets. Sometimes Israel will be corrupt and the king will be doing all kinds of horrible things, but they're still following the religious rituals and they're still offering sacrifices to Yahweh and to God. And the prophets will say, God hates your offerings. God hates your sacrifices because you're not obeying his laws. You're not following his commandments, and your rituals are just empty. And that, again, is something that's not just a problem in ancient Israel. That's a problem, that is all through history, going through the motions of religion, but not having it really be in your heart. The motions of religion, the ritual of religion, if it's apart from devotion to God and obedience to God, those rituals become meaningless. And the same would be true in Christianity. Communion, baptism, all those things are meaningless if they're just going through the motions. They don't mean anything unless your heart is in it. So Saul says to Samuel, verse 24, I've sinned. I've violated the Lord's command and your instructions. Okay, he's like, okay, you got me. I was afraid of the people. I gave in to them. So, basically, it's not my fault. They just wanted the plunder. I gave in. Okay, you're right. I beg you, forgive my sin. Come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. It's like, well, okay, you're right. I messed up. I gave in. They wanted the plunder. I gave in. Okay, you're right. But you come with me and let's go together and, come with me. And Samuel said, I will not go back with you. You've rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. In other words, don't you get it? You're done. It's king. As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught a hold of the hem of his robe, like, hey, don't leave me. And it tore. Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today. Now, this is what you've just done is symbolic of a bigger reality. You tore my robe. Well, God is tearing the kingdom away from you. He's torn the kingdom of Israel away from you today and given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind. He is not a man that he should change his mind. This is your time as king is going to draw to a close. God has removed his blessing on your monarchy. Saul replied, I've sinned. Please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel went back with Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. Saul still doesn't really get it. He just doesn't see that what he's done is that bad or that wrong. And Samuel said, bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites. Remember, he was supposed to kill all the Amalekites. Here's the king. He took him as hostage. He didn't kill the king of the Amalekites. He took him alive. Agag came to him confidently, thinking, surely the bitterness of death is past. In other words, I escaped. But Samuel said, as your sword has made women childless, so your mother will be childless among women. And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord. He did what Saul would not do and killed the king of the Amalekites. And Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him. And the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel. So this is the last time Saul and Samuel are together. And it says that Samuel mourned for Saul. Saul's not dead, but he mourns for what could have been. He mourns for this man who had such a strong start and a strong beginning. He was a great soldier. He had many good qualities, but he wasn't going to listen and follow what God told him to do. And he was going to make a lot of excuses. And he loses the throne. Now, does it happen that day? No. Remember, when he was anointed king, it was a private anointing between him and Samuel. He didn't assume leadership the day that Samuel poured oil on his head and said, "You're going to be the king." He didn't become king that day. He didn't become king until the little lottery thing. And he didn't become king in the eyes of the men and the people really until the battle that he successfully rescued that city. But he says to Saul, "You're done as king." Now, he continues to reign as king for quite a while after this in the story of Samuel. As a matter of fact, we're going to see, I'm not going to go into the next part because I only have 2 or 3 minutes left, but the next part is where we're going to meet David. And again, spoiler alert, preview of next week, Samuel is going to go and anoint this kid, David, and said he's going to anoint him as the new king. But David doesn't become king immediately. As a matter of fact, it's a long journey from the anointing that when Samuel pours oil on David's head and said, "This is the Lord's anointed," David is still a kid at that point. This is before David and Goliath. This is before any of the other stuff. But Samuel says, "You're the next king. You're going to be the king." Now, how David becomes the king is, a journey that's going to take quite a few chapters, because we're going to see Saul first love and embrace David, and then become insanely jealous of him. And that's going to cause that. This is the heart really of the whole Saul and David relationship. It says at the beginning, Saul loved David so much. He's a musician. He's a great soldier. He's loyal. Saul loves David until he doesn't. Until David's popularity with the people starts to rub on Saul, starts to get his goat, and he becomes insanely jealous of David and turns on him. And that's what makes the story tragic and also fascinating, because of what it says about leadership, what it says about how jealousy can turn love to hate, and how we see Saul fall lower and lower and lower, and he becomes unrecognizable. He goes from hero to villain in this story, and it is tragic. I think it kind of is a story that we've seen repeated in history over and over again, how jealousy and can tear people, turn love into hate and destroy. Jealousy is, as they say, what a green-eyed monster, right? Jealousy is a terrible, terrible thing, and it's the driving force in the dynamic between Saul and David. So this is say the beginning of the really meatiest part of this whole book, where we finally get to David and all those stories. Any comment, question about this whole Saul story? It really would make a great movie, I think. I mean, if it was really done right. So next week we will get to chapter 16, and that's all the great stories, David and Goliath, and all that other stuff. So anyway, let's pray. Lord, thank you again for all you do and all you are. We pray in your name. Amen. All right, guys. Okay. Yeah, yeah. 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 Well, the story of the Bible itself, I mean, it's a fascinating story how, I mean, when I was a kid or even when I was a teenager, well, where'd the Bible come from? Well, didn't it just, fall out of heaven and then just, you know, like, well, how did we actually get the Bible? And first thing that comes into your head is like realize, oh, it's a translation. It wasn't written in English. You realize, oh, it was written in this whole other language or these other languages, and what we have is a translation. And then you realize, oh, it was, it's not a book, it's 66 books, and all these different authors across hundreds of years, and then you start realizing, well, how did we get the Bible we have? Well, these ancient manuscripts that were copies of copies of copies of copies, and you realize that the story of where the Bible came from is not simple. It's got a lot of, it's an organic process, and that's what differentiates Christianity, frankly, from Islam, and that's why we treat our Bible with great reverence and love. It's God's revealed word through humans. It's God uses fallible humans to record, to inspire them to record the great power and mysteries and miracles of God. Islam, believes that God dictated it to Muhammad. That the Quran is the literal dictation of God. And so their understanding of the Quran is very different from our understanding of the Bible. They believe God, through the angel Gabriel, dictated it to Muhammad. Muhammad was illiterate, could neither read nor write, so he then dictated it to somebody who could read and write over about a 25-year period, and that's where the Quran came from. The word Quran means literally recitation, because Muhammad claimed that the angel dictated it to him, and then he dictated it to the person who could write, and that's where the Quran came from. And, I've never read the entire Quran. I have a copy. I have a legal copy of the Quran, because it's illegal to copy the Quran into any other language. You can only have the Quran in Arabic. It's illegal to translate it. But people have, of course. And I have a translation of the Quran. I haven't read the whole thing, but the parts that are when Muhammad dictated it over the course of 20 plus years, the later the passage, the more radical it is. You know what I mean? The early passages talk about being how Christians, Jews, and Muslims are all people of the book, and they should all be treated well, and da 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 da. And by the later chapters of the Quran that were dictated 20 years later, it's convert or die, convert to Islam, or the infidel. The passages that are the early passages are much more beneficent and open than the later passages that are much more militant and exclusionary. And there's even a few verses in there that are so crazy that they say, well, that was Satan who slipped those in there. Yeah. Well, have you ever heard a book called The Satanic Verses by a guy named Salman Rushdie? They put a fatwa on him that he should be executed for writing that book. He explored the fact of these verses in the Quran that were called satanic. They were slipped in there by Satan, supposedly. Anyway, I'm not a Quran scholar by any means, huh? Well, Muhammad was a soldier and a military leader, and he conquered with the sword. He went into Mecca and basically said, surrender or die, and they all surrendered. And what's remarkable about Muhammad is that in his lifetime, he conquered the entire Arabian Peninsula and turned the entire peninsula to Islam just in his lifetime. Before Muhammad, it was all polytheistic tribes and pagan religions all throughout Arabia. And Muhammad, just in his lifetime, with the sword, made the entire subcontinent Muslim. Just in his lifetime. So, as a military leader, Muhammad was a genius. As a religious leader, I would have a different opinion. Muhammad saw himself as the greatest of all prophets and greater than any Old Testament prophet, greater than Jesus. And he was the last and final prophet, according to himself. And, I think, especially before 9/11, most Americans had such a very minuscule understanding of Islam. I mean, most Americans, and myself included, just did not really understand Islam. And its history, and really understand who Muhammad was, and really understand that conflict of worldviews between the Western world of Christianity and Judaism and the Muslim world, and how those two are like oil and water. They just do not match up. And I think since 9/11, hopefully Americans know a whole lot more than they did. Not to be political, but right after 9/11, President Bush said, Islam means peace. It does not. The word Islam means submission. The word Islam means submission. A Muslim is one who submits. Muslim is one who submits. Islam is submission. So, anyway, that's another rabbit trail. But
I like your rabbit trail.
Yeah.
Making the rounds going down. I said, why is God so angry? Because we were
Right. Yeah.
desperate.
Right. I personally think that until we come to Jesus, we don't really. The people did not have a clear understanding of who God really was. That they saw God act and they interpreted it, but they didn't maybe fully know His heart until Jesus. Yeah, that's the reason. I often said that the Bible, we call it Old Testament, New Testament. Better names would be Old Covenant, New Covenant would be a more appropriate name for the two halves of the Bible. But as a matter of fact, just this week, this coming Sunday, I'm going to mention how when Jesus said, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say this." Well, when he says you've heard it said, that's in the Old Testament. He's quoting the Old Testament and saying, you've heard it said this, but I say this.
The Old Testament is leading up to him, and if you don't accept Mary and the virgin birth, I don't think you can accept anything.
I think it's a vital part of our faith. Yeah.
Thank you for being who you are.
Oh, well, thank you.
I appreciated our son, who is Baptist and shoved it down his throat.
Yeah.
Sent me a text 2 weeks ago. He says, and he was in Wisconsin. He was in a sermon this morning. He came to Christmas Eve services with us.
Oh,
Saw you, listened to you, like.